Yes, I will be discussing the art of persuasion today, which is a little bit of a tall order for a 40-minute discussion, but I'm going to do my best to cover the major highlights of the art of persuasion. Some of the areas that we'll explore are what persuasion is and is not. We're going to talk about some of the common terms that are associated with persuasion that might not have very much of a positive connotation, but that don't necessarily hit at the heart of what persuasion is. We'll also be talking about how to craft an effective persuasive message and some of the elements that go into this. We'll talk about the role of credibility in persuasion, how important it is to be seen as a credible individual by your audience. We'll talk about the concept of going with the crowd and how this plays into persuasion. We'll explore the use of verbal and nonverbal communication in persuasion because both are essential. And lastly, we'll be talking about some ethical issues concerning persuasion because you can never talk about an issue in communication without talking about the ethics behind it. So first we're going to talk a little bit about why I call this the art of influence rather than a science. Although there are scientific theories, scientific thoughts that go into persuasion, they tap into psychology a lot. Persuasion is a field that's so complex, it's so broad, that it's incredibly difficult to measure and to quantify. So although there are numbers, it's not like we can't do statistical evidence and stuff for persuasion. It is still an art. We're crafting these messages, but there's no way that we can delineate exactly what counts as a persuasive message and what does not. All right, so the big question, why should we even care about persuasion? And the big reason is that the world we live in is completely saturated with persuasive messages. It is everywhere we turn in the daily world. If we look into the arts, like movies and books, you can see authors trying to convey a persuasive message through the content of their works. To Kill a Mockingbird and Their Eyes Were Watching God are some very well-known books that were talking about civil liberties. They're bringing up these issues in the form of the arts to bring awareness to the public and to hope for a change, for a positive change. Schindler's List could also be considered as a persuasive message through talking about the Holocaust, talking about these terrible actions that have occurred. The director, Steven Spielberg, is hoping to convince the audience, this is a terrible thing. We don't want this to ever happen again, and this is why. You can see it when you look on your Pinterest board, especially for us girls. So if you look, I took screenshots of my stuff so I don't feel like I'm invading people's privacy. But if you look at these pictures, you see like these random people, individual names that have posted these pictures that they think are interesting. And then all of a sudden you see this post that says promoted by. And it's this image that if you look at it, it just seems to fit really well with the overall theme of my Pinterest board, so they know what I like. But they're trying to persuade me through this image and through their description that this piece, this could also play into marketing a little bit, that this piece fits with my persona, it fits with the, they're trying to persuade me that this will be a good item for me. And again, I didn't want to invade other people's privacy, so I put my own social media on here. Social media is a huge area where we see persuasion, especially in a personal way. A lot of times we think of persuasion as only like me standing up here giving a speech to you, think of it in politics, but it applies just as much to interpersonal relationships, to the content that we put on our social media. Through our social media, what we put on there, we're trying to convince our audience, whether that be friends or random people, that this is what we're passionate about, this is who we are. And again, we can't talk about persuasion without talking about politics, which is why it's very convenient that this year I have the speech about persuasion while we have a crazy presidential candidacy going on. So we'll be talking more about that, you can be assured. All right, so additional reasons that we should study persuasion, besides just that we're surrounded by it every day, is that knowledge makes an informed consumer. When you see all of these persuasive messages around you, if you don't understand persuasion and why people are crafting messages the way that they are, why they're being placed the way that they are, why you're reacting the way that you are, you might make an uninformed decision, a rash decision, you might regret it later. So it's good to know about the art of persuasion and know how it works so that you can be an informed consumer in this world. And lastly, persuasion does not equal manipulation or any of those other negative words that are associated with it, which we will talk about more later. All right, so right now we're going to delve into some of the very negative terms that are associated with persuasion. Some people might argue that it should be called the art of the con instead of the art of influence. So some terms that are associated with persuasion include brainwashing, coercion, convincing, indoctrination, propaganda, and manipulation. And just going through this list, I'm going to make a guess that none of you are feeling very positive about the theme going on here. I wouldn't if this was what I thought persuasion was in its entirety. But it's really important to realize that although these terms have become associated with persuasion, they don't hit at the heart of what persuasion truly means. So then what is persuasion if it's not manipulation, coercion, all these other things? According to Gaston Cider, persuasion involves one or more persons who are engaged in the activity of creating, reinforcing, modifying, or extinguishing beliefs, attitudes, intentions, motivations, and or behaviors within the constraints of a given communication context. So it's a very broad, very big definition. It's a little bit difficult to wrestle with. So we're going to go through some of the goals of communication in persuasion that are addressed through this definition. Some of the goals of persuasion involve the changing of opinions. So you might have an audience that you're addressing, and they're seeing things in a certain way, and you really want to be able to shift the way that they think about an issue. You might provide them information on the opposite side of what they believe that maybe they hadn't thought about before. And you frame it in the way that they can see, oh, maybe the way that I've thought about this in the past, maybe I feel a little bit differently about it now. Persuasion can also be focused on creating new beliefs or attitudes. So if you have an audience that doesn't really have much information on the topic that you're discussing, by providing information, by giving your insight into the topic, you can help to create an opinion, a belief, an attitude about the topic. And this is a really powerful way that persuasion can be used. It's also a way that persuasion can be used really negatively, but we'll talk more about the negative uses later. Another goal of persuasion is to reinforce attitudes that already exist. So you might have a group that you're talking to, and I guess politics is a really good example of this. Sorry if you hate politics. I don't really enjoy politics, but it very much fits into this discussion, so we'll talk about it anyway. So if you have a political candidate that's talking to his or her audience, they're going to be not only presenting messages that, try to gain people to their side, they will definitely be saying things that solidify the audience that they already have. They want to keep those people who are already attracted to them, and this creates a really strong consumer base for whoever is persuading. It could be politics, it could be anything else. So this is definitely something that we see through the political race. And the fourth goal of persuasion is an attempt to eliminate beliefs or attitudes. So if somebody already has a solidified idea about something and you're like, that's not a good idea, then through the information that you give them, through the messages that you create, you can be attempting to just say to them, nope, that's not what I think about this anymore. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about ELM, which is the elaboration likelihood model of Petty and Cacioppo, because this gives a really good insight into persuasion, and it's one of the most widely cited theories in the field of persuasion, so it's important to have firm understanding of it before we address the topic any farther. So in this model, Petty and Cacioppo argue that there are two ways that people go about interpreting a message that is delivered to them. One of these is called the central route. So we'll talk a little bit about this more in detail in a minute, but on the central route, if people are really invested in an issue, they might already have some information, they might have background knowledge, they might have lots of personal connections to a topic, then they're going to be more inclined to really focus on the heart of the issue. They're not going to be distracted by all the other stuff going on around. They want to know what is true. They want to know, just like if a person's giving a speech, they're not going to be distracted by what they're wearing, any of these things. They just want to know what they're talking about. The peripheral route, or peripheral processing, on the other hand, is when an individual is influenced by all of the other factors in a message besides just the heart of the message. And so, like I was saying, this could be the clothes that people are wearing. This could be the setting. So whether they're in a college setting, whether they're at a rally, whether they're at a mosh pit, I've never been in one of those before. So the environment and the artifacts, all of these different things that are involved in the message but aren't the message, can influence the way that people make decisions. And from the way that I'm describing these, you can tell that in an ideal world, we would really like people to all focus on the central route, because that would be great, if we just hear a message and we're just listening to the message. But I'm sure you all realize that in this world, most of us are distracted by all the peripheral things. And so it's important in the art of persuasion to recognize that the peripheral cues make just as much of a difference in the delivery of the message as the actual message itself. So as I mentioned briefly before, some of the main factors that influence which route people will take in interpreting a message is the motivation that they have. So like I said, if somebody has a really personal connection to the issue, let's say that it has to do with breast cancer, and in your family there's been a history of that, you will be a lot more inclined to look at the facts and listen to the hardcore message than to be distracted by like the color pink or whatever, all of these other things that are going on with the message. So an individual's motivation has a lot to do with whether they'll use the central or the peripheral routes. Additionally, the individual's ability makes a big difference. And this is an area where it's really important for the persuader to recognize their influence, because if an individual or an audience doesn't have an understanding of the topic that is being addressed, they might not have the ability to choose the central route. So an example I thought of is if I was talking to a neurosurgeon and he was explaining to me all of his stuff, I would have no idea what he's talking about. And so I might just think, oh, he's a neurosurgeon, he knows what he's talking about, so I'll believe him. However, if it was somebody who was in that field, they would be listening to what he was saying and they would be attracted to his message, not just to his credibility, which again is something that we will address in just a moment. So we're going to look a little bit into how we should craft persuasive messages. And this is an area where there are unlimited elements that go into it, so I just had to focus on a few of the important ones. Something that I wanted to discuss is the difference between an implicit and an explicit persuasive message. This was discussed by Curtis, Kim, and Lim. An implicit message is delivered in a way that doesn't tell the audience what they should do. It gives a framework, it gives ideas, and it makes the audience hopefully go in the direction that the persuader is wanting them to. An explicit message, on the other hand, directly tells the audience, you should do this. So an example would be in a restaurant commercial, if you have Burger King or McDonald's, and the Burger King commercial is saying, come try our Big Mac, it's 99 cents or something. That is an example of an explicit message. So the audience knows what they're supposed to be doing. An implicit message, on the other hand, might be, let's say there's a fancy restaurant commercial and they show the inside of the restaurant, they show how nice the setting is, they show all these nicely dressed people sitting in comfy chairs in a cozy environment. They don't ever have to say necessarily, you need to come visit us. They'll deliver some kind of message about why this is an awesome place to be, why you should come see us, without necessarily having to state that you should come see us. So this plays into the elaboration likelihood model really well, which is why one of the reasons why we needed to address it earlier. The motivation of the audience can have a big impact on whether implicit or explicit messages work really well. It used to be thought in the field of persuasion that you should really only use explicit messages because you don't want people to get confused about what you're discussing. You don't want people to do the wrong thing. This applies to the field of public relations, like we talked about earlier. But it's recently been sort of reconsidered a little bit, and this has to do with the motivation of the audience. As I mentioned before, the motivation of the audience impacts whether they are going to really focus on the message and read into the message a lot. And it's actually been sort of recently thought that if an audience has a higher motivation and feels that the message has a higher personal relevance to them, they're going to be a lot more likely to want to draw their own conclusions. And so in these cases, implicit messages might work a lot better than just telling them flat out what they should do. And as you can probably sense a theme from what I'm talking about here, the best type of message, whether implicit or explicit, is always linked to the audience profile. And so it's important to understand if your audience is already really knowledgeable about your subject, if your audience already has a high personal interest in it, in order to determine what types of messages you should use. Another element of crafting a persuasive message is the use of evidence, and this was also discussed in the elaboration likelihood model of Petty and Cacioppo. The use of evidence plays really heavily into central processing. If you're focused on the heart of an issue, if you're listening to a message and you really want to know the truth about it, you're going to want to hear those facts. You want statistics, you want stories, you want to know that what you're hearing is the truth, and you don't want to just hear it from that one person. You want to know that it's true across the board. The use of evidence helps to improve the credibility of the speaker, and we're going to delve in depth into what credibility looks like, but just know for now, it's important. You want to be credible. There are two different types of evidence. There's statistical and there's anecdotal. So statistical is what I think about when I think about the science building, lots of numbers. And anecdotal involves more storytelling. Neither is better than the other, but they might be more influential in different situations. Okay, and then a really interesting part of crafting persuasive messages is whether you should focus on quantity or quality of your messaging. As you can probably assume, quality works really well with central processing. If somebody is going along that route and they want to know truth, they want to know it in detail. They want to know depth behind the story. On the other hand, if people are more focused on the peripheral issues, quantity can actually serve as a peripheral cue. So the fact that somebody has a whole bunch of reasons for something, even if they're not good reasons, might be enough evidence for somebody to agree with their persuasive message. As I said, it's used as a peripheral cue, and this is who I think of when I think of quantity versus quality. You know, we can be talking about Donald Trump's political campaign and wondering, why in the world are people following him? Like, why does he have a following? It doesn't make sense. He just says he's great at everything. Everything's good. But if you listen to his speeches, you can hear that he just says a lot of things. He gives a lot of reasons why people should follow him. He might not give detail on how he's going to build that wall. He might not give detail on how he's going to defeat ISIS, but he's going to do it. And so to individuals who might not have a lot of knowledge on how difficult it is to actually make those things happen, or how complex the field of international relations and politics are, they might think, oh, he's got it. He's got everything covered. He's not just focusing on this one thing. He's focused on all of it. And that face, though. So the big takeaway of this segment, when we're talking about crafting a persuasive message, you need to know your audience. And this is the heart of all communication, is that when you're delivering a message, if you don't understand who you're talking to, you don't understand their background or their motivations or their preferences or their beliefs, then your message is probably not going to be as effective as you want it to be. It's essential to do a lot of research into understanding your audience in order to craft an effective persuasive message. All right, so now the one I've been teasing you with, we're going to talk about credibility a little bit. According to O'Keefe, credibility is called judgments made by a perceiver concerning the believability of a communicator. So some important things to draw from this is that credibility is not something I determine internally. I cannot just say I'm a credible individual. I might think I am, but credibility is only determined when other people believe that I am reliable, that I know what I'm talking about. So again, credibility is not something you can just determine inside. You have to work with people on the outside, and that influences the way that you shape your persuasive messages. 3 dimensions of credibility are expertise, trustworthiness, and goodwill. In expertise, people really want to know that you know what you're talking about. You don't want to stand up there and start spouting off facts, and then you're like, oh, I forgot. What was that thing I was supposed to talk about? Dang it. You don't really look like you know what you're talking about. If I were to do that up here, you guys would probably be like, wow, you really did not research for your presentation, did you? So you need to show your audience that you understand your topic in depth. You also need to convey to the audience that you're trustworthy. Your audience needs to know that you're honest and that you actually plan to bring about or to deliver your message and its contents. You need to also convey goodwill, show that you care about people, that you're not just there to get ahead in life, that you are concerned about the welfare of those around you. And credibility is actually considered to be a peripheral cue. So it's one of those things that when people are focused on all of the things except the message itself, they will look at the credibility of the source. So again, in my example of the neurosurgeon, I look at him and think, he's got a doctor, he knows his stuff. He went to school for a long time and I have no idea what he's talking about. But he does, and so he's credible in my eyes because he understands what he's discussing. This quote from Aristotle says that character may almost be called the most effective means of persuasion. And character could also be argued as credibility, the way that you portray your character to those around you. And so this is an essential part of persuasion. If you're seen as an uncredible individual to your audience, your message is probably not going to have as great of an impact as you want it to. So, some ways to get credibility, according to Gass and Sider. Be prepared. If you're going to talk about something, do a lot of research and understand the background of your topic. This will really enhance your credibility and show that you're an expert in the field that you're talking about. Additionally, you need to cite evidence and identify your sources. Like I said, it doesn't matter if you believe it if the rest of the known public does not agree with what you're saying. If you don't have some experts who have done other research in that area to back up what you're saying, you're not going to be seen as a credible source. Additionally, you need to display goodwill towards the audience. And improve likability. These two go together really well. So listen to people, smile with them, say thank you. These really impact the way that people interpret your message. If you come across as really condescending and you seem like you don't care about the people that you're with, they're probably not going to really listen to your message because they're just thinking, well, he's a jerk, he doesn't care about me. It's also essential to use an assertive style of communication in persuasion. This just means you communicate in a way that shows this is how it is, I know what I'm talking about. And we'll talk about some of the ways that sort of take away from that on a future slide. Another way that you can increase your credibility is to have a credible individual endorse you. This kind of goes along with citing your sources, but if you have somebody who's already seen as a credible individual in your field, so they have to like connect with what you're talking about, then having them come up and say, this is so-and-so, and I agree with what they're saying. They really know what they're talking about. You should listen to their message. This can definitely increase the credibility of your message and the likelihood that your audience will interpret your message the way that you want them to. So we're going to watch a brief clip, because again, we've got to bring politics into this. And this is an advertisement for Bernie Sanders' campaign this year. And we're just going to talk briefly afterwards about some of the examples you can see through this of building credibility.
The son of a Polish immigrant who grew up in a Brooklyn tenement, he went to public schools, then college, where the work of his life began, fighting injustice and inequality, speaking truth to power. He moved to Vermont, won election and praise as one of America's best mayors. In Congress, he stood up for working families and for principle, opposing the Iraq War, supporting veterans. Tackling climate change to create clean energy jobs, fighting for living wages, equal pay, and tuition-free public colleges.
People are sick and tired of establishment politics, and they want real change.
Bernie Sanders, husband, father, grandfather, an honest leader, building a movement with you to give us a future to believe in.
I'm Bernie Sanders, and I approve this message.
So as you can see through that video, you notice him smiling, you notice him speaking in a very firm, commanding way, saying people want change. Through the political field, you can definitely see attempts to bolster credibility. I thought this was a really good example of somebody he did a pretty good job in this, of bringing in the elements of credibility. It shows his past, it shows how he's been consistent, he's trustworthy, he's honest. They had to throw that word in there. So in the political field, you definitely see the use of credibility building techniques. We're going to talk a little bit about the idea of going with the crowd. This is definitely a human tendency. You know, if there's a group of people that you identify with, you want to follow them. Indoctrination, so one of those negative terms that we think of in regards to persuasion, might fit in really well here because you can think of cults. So with this idea, you can see how persuasion might get some of the negative names that it has. If you have a negative leader who's trying to get people to do bad things, but they're really good at convincing them to do those things, that can really give a bad name to persuasion. Identification is discussed by Burke, and it's said that if an individual identifies really strongly with a group, so they think that they connect with them, they agree with their ideals, then this can lead to ethnocentrism and groupthink within that individual and within the group. Ethnocentrism is when you look at another culture and you're only able to see them through the eyes of your culture, so you can't really understand them because you're focused on your group's cultural themes. Groupthink is when everybody's thinking one way, so you're like, I'm going that way too. And that can lead to some really negative results, like putting people on the outside, exclusion. And it's really important in groups to have people going against the current because it does help keep people in check. Otherwise, you can have persuasion gone mad, where a negative group leader with a negative message might cause really bad things to happen. You can think about this with like the fight for civil rights. You have all of these people who believe that one group of individuals is inferior to another, and everybody's just going with it because that's how they believe, that's what everybody else is thinking. But it's only when people like Martin Luther and all of these other individuals choose to go against the current that you get change. And that's why persuasion, although it might be used in a negative way, can also be used for powerful positive change. All right, so some of the reasons why people tend to go with the group, according to Insoko and Schopler, is a desire and a motivation to achieve the group's goals. So if you identify strongly with the group, you want to help accomplish the goals of that group. Another reason why people go with the crowd is called the social comparison theory, and this is where you believe that your view of who you are comes from your comparison to those around you. And so an involvement in a group that sort of bolsters your self-image might be a reason that you choose to just go along with them. Another reason is consistency. So let's say there's a group of individuals that you find as a whole really attractive to you. You like the way they think, you like the way they appear, you like the way other people perceive them, but you might disagree with something that they're saying. There's this dissonance going on with in your mind, and so you're like, oh, I think I like them more than I dislike this idea, so I'm going to convince myself that they're actually right. And that might not be a conscious thought. A lot of that happens subconsciously. Another idea within going with the crowd is the idea of personal versus social knowledge. Personal knowledge is what we learn through experiencing it. So if I actually go through something or I research it myself, that would count as personal knowledge. Social knowledge is what I gain from interacting with others and from talking with others. So the weight that you put on each of those influences how much you're inclined to go with the crowd. If you put a lot more influence on social knowledge, then you will be more likely to go with what others are saying. And the last one is the hedonistic hypothesis, which argues that people go with the crowd so that they can avoid pain and gain pleasure, that it's much easier to go with the crowd and just enjoy yourself than to fight against the current. Lord Chesterfield said to take the tone of the company you are in, and even if this might not sound like an incredibly positive idea, it does really reflect the idea that people like to go with the company that they're in. All right, we're going to look at persuasion through verbal and nonverbal methods. First, looking at language and symbols. Symbols can be names. They're words that they say something and they stand for a whole other idea. Some examples of these are ultimate terms, which can also be called God terms. So ones like liberty and justice that bring up all of these connotations behind them. They might be kind of ambiguous in their meaning, in their exact meaning, but to the culture they understand what it's supposed to mean. Aphorisms are wise words that are passed down that people use. Doublespeak and euphemisms are words that are substituted for other words in order to soften the blow. An example that I've heard many times is instead of somebody saying that somebody died, if somebody died, you say they passed away, because it, for some reason, just sounds a lot nicer than the other version. Powerless language falls into this, and this is the hardest thing to avoid, because you don't want powerless language in your speech. You don't come across as a persuasive individual. And I know for me, I've gotten a lot better at this over the years, but it's definitely a struggle to not include these things. So I'm glad this is towards the end and you can't count the ones that I've done throughout the speech. Hesitations, including ums, uhs, like, those are things that communicate you're not really sure what you're talking about. You don't want those. Hedging clauses, intensifiers using things like really and very. It's very hard for me to avoid doing that. Polite forms, tag questions, another thing that's difficult, because I do that in my everyday life, but you don't necessarily want to do that when you're delivering a persuasive message. If I'm running for president and I say, we should defeat ISIS, don't you think? It doesn't come across as you being the leader and knowing what you're talking about. Disclaimers are another form of powerless language. And then we're going to go into nonverbals, which aren't always thought about a lot, but they're equally as important as the verbal part of communication and persuasion. Immediacy is language that communicates warmth and friendliness. So this can involve smiles, can involve handshakes. It shows people that you care and communicate with them on a deeper level. Some types of nonverbals include kinesics, which is movement, so me standing up here going like this. Haptics, touch, so if I were to shake your hand. Proxemics, so this is the distance between individuals. Chronemics, so this is the use of time in persuasion. Artifacts, physical objects like clothing or this desk or my water bottle. Physical appearance, if I looked like I just rolled out of bed when I came in here, might not be as persuasive as if I'd actually put myself together. And paralinguistics, so this can be the tone of my persuasion, this can be the pitch of my voice, if I'm talking really fast or if I'm talking super slow and put you guys all to sleep. Alright, so now the big one that we always have to talk about, and this is ethics within persuasion. Like I mentioned at the beginning, there are a lot of associations, a lot of negative associations with persuasion, but there is a difference between persuasion in and of itself being unethical and being used unethically. Persuasion, from its definition, is not an unethical thing, but it can be used in bad ways, and we've seen many examples of that. So, delivering a persuasive message isn't negative, but the way that Hitler did it was negative. He was a very persuasive individual, but it was used in an unethical way to harm individuals. Persuasion takes on the moral character of the persuader's motives. So, persuasion doesn't necessarily have moral character in and of itself, because it's kind of an inanimate thing. But if the persuader is determined to do good through it, then it should take on that desire from the persuader. It gets a little complicated because it also depends on the way that the audience interprets the message, but coming from the persuader, it's important that the message is ethical. And ethical persuasion translates into ethical leadership. You can't talk about leadership without thinking of persuasion, because that's basically the heart of what leadership is. It's convincing others that your ideas are the ones that they should go with. I thought that this quote from John Quincy Adams summarized that really well. If your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, you are a leader. And this ties equally into persuasion. If your messages inspire others to become the best they can be, to enact positive social change, to bring about peace and prosperity, I know that sounds really cheesy, but it's the truth, then you are a positive, persuasive leader. And that should be the goal of persuasion, is to create positive change and to just bring the world together through the messages that you're able to convey to others. Thank you for your time.